Section 2 of the Land History of America. And in Section 2 here, I think it's one of my favorite sections. Of course, I like the whole class, actually, but this is one of my favorite sections. And the reason why is because we talk about longitude, latitude, and time, and how those relate to each other. We spend some time in this section going through what the big issue with longitude is, because for years and years, centuries, they were able to determine what latitude was because you have a sextant and you can tell what from the horizon to a given star or whatever, and you can calculate your latitude. And as you know, latitude are those lines that are parallel to the equator. Whereas longitude are those lines that are going from north to south, and in order to determine longitude, you have to have time. You have to have accurate time in multiple locations simultaneously. So this became a big challenge, and for hundreds and hundreds of years, for centuries, we did not know how to solve the problem. And you'd find maps were off, and explorers were struggling with where they were, both on land and sea, particularly at sea, because land, you have landmarks, and of course on the ocean you don't. And so it's very difficult, and it was for centuries, for them to tell where they were longitudinally. So we cover this area, what happens, how this gets determined, and the big solution to it is finding an accurate way of determining time and an efficient way of determining time. And that's where we get into John Harrison and his watch. Start up being clocks and several different iterations there. There was the Longitude Act that came into effect in England to provide an incentive for inventive people to come up with ways of determining longitude at sea, and actually on land as well, but this focus was on sea. And it took almost 100 years before that really got completely resolved, but it had a huge impact then. Once we could determine where we were longitudinally, that with what we already knew with latitude, then you've got an exact or fairly exact, accurate, a fairly exact location of where you are on the Earth, whether by sea or by land. So this was a significant issue, and it affected basically the whole world of travel and navigation, both surveyors and explorers and seafaring people. So we talk a fair amount about that, and then we get into that with we talk a little bit about Greenwich, and go through a section on Greenwich and the establishment of the prime meridian, which is the zero longitude line basically, and there were lots of different meridians. Anyway, so we'll talk about all those kinds of things in this class, in this section, I mean. And then we get into this Pre-Columbian era, before Colonial America was really discovered. And I put some focus on this a little bit because there was a lot of things that were going on. It's not correct to think that Columbus was the first one to discover America. There's so much evidence that says that that's not the case. There were fishermen and other explorers who were there before, and there were people on this continent, on this American continent, and particularly North America, but we also know in South America as well. But as it relates to America, our country here, there were people here before. And, there's some interesting things about that. This Pre-Columbian America is what I call it. And so we get into that. There's a book that I refer to called 1491. And then there's another book about the Asian civilization, 1421, that talks about China's discoveries of the world by Gavin Menzies. An interesting book as well. There's the whole discoveries and exploring of the Empire of Islam. We don't take that approach here right now. What I'm taking with this class, because I've had to just narrow it down a little bit, and it's not necessarily, it is a choice, but it's not necessarily one that is a bad choice, because the bulk of our history comes from Europe. So we're kind of, here in this country, we have a Eurocentric sort of view. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only view or that's the only correct view, and that because in fact there are other views out there. The Asian view of the world is different, and the Islamic view of the world is different. They had their explorers and discoverers too, but a lot of the influence on the land history of America came from Europe, and in particular from England. And we've adopted laws and land laws and all kinds of things that were associated with those countries, and then of course made our own as well. So this pre-Columbian idea is an important concept to look at. And there's also, then we get into actually the colonial era. So we start talking about, people like John Smith and Pocahontas, which was a real person. They were both real. And the maps that he made, the exploring he did, the surveying that he did to make those maps. We get into all the different kinds of surveying instruments in the colonial era, most of which came from Europe, particularly England, but we adopted those things here in this country. Early on, the instruments were different. They weren't some of them, at least at first, weren't as sophisticated because we had to make a lot of things out of wood. Brass was very expensive and had to be imported or brought over from Europe. Then we started to get some more of these instruments. And so the whole thing on instruments is very interesting in this country and what happened there, and a lot more to be learned about it as well than what I'm covering in this class. We talked about the establishment of colonies and these ideas of where did Pennsylvania come from? Why did the colonies take on the shapes and the boundaries that they did, the different charters that were associated with it, and so on. There were some conflicts there. Interesting story about Maryland and choosing the river there to determine their south boundary. It turns out that the river went clear north, almost touching the southern boundary of Pennsylvania, cutting off a lot of the boundary of what Lord Baltimore thought he had for Maryland. Anyway, a lot of different stuff with that. We talk about the Mason-Dixon line and how that came to be and how it set the precedence for surveying in this country. We talk, even then, we get into a little bit before the Revolution, kind of leading up to it. We talk about George Washington and military geography and how much mapping and George Washington's knowledge of surveying as a professional surveyor also helped in the cause of the Revolution. So a lot of interesting things in this section, fun stuff to talk about. It's sort of really the founding parts of our country and some of the ideas that were associated with land and land tenure here in this country that became later propagated throughout the United States. But this is the early years in the colony years. So look forward to going through this with you, and hopefully you will be able to understand the value of it. And of course, realize that it's not exhaustive. There's a lot more things to learn, and that's where I want you to pique your interest in this area and be able to go from there. So hope you have fun with this section.